In the cold vacuum of space, where 1,000 alien species gather to prove their worth among the stars, there exists one universal truth that echoes through every training facility, every barracks, every battlefield. Underestimate a human at your own peril. They called her weak. They called her soft. They pushed her down, expecting her to break like glass against concrete. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chen had already been broken once before, in the mountains of Afghanistan, where she learned that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. Now, as alien cadets tower over her with their superior strength, enhanced reflexes, and natural weapons, they're about to discover what happens when you corner a predator who's already survived hell. Some lessons are learned through textbooks. Others are written in blood and determination. This is the story of how one human reminded the galaxy that Earth doesn't just breed survivors, it breeds warriors who refuse to stay down. The Galactic Military Academy thought they knew what they were getting when they accepted their first human recruit. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the transport platform, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder as she stared up at the massive structure that would be her home for the next 4 years. The Galactic Military Academy stretched impossibly high into the artificial atmosphere of Station Kepler, its crystalline walls reflecting the light of 3 different suns. Ships from 100 worlds docked and departed in perfect synchronization, their alien designs both beautiful and intimidating. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her combat boots echoing against the metal decking. At 28, Sarah was older than most recruits, but her service record spoke for itself. 8 years as a Navy SEAL, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Purple Hearts, and enough scars to tell stories she'd rather forget. When the Galactic Council finally acknowledged humanity's existence and offered them a single slot in their military academy, the choice had been unanimous among Earth's commanders. Sarah Chen was their best. The reception hall buzzed with activity as hundreds of alien cadets moved through orientation procedures. Sarah found herself surrounded by beings that defied every expectation she'd had about extraterrestrial life. To her left, a group of crystalline entities that looked like living diamonds chatted in harmonious tones that sounded like wind chimes. Behind her, reptilian humanoids with scales that shifted color based on their emotions stood in perfect formation. But it was the group directly ahead that caught her attention and made her blood run cold with recognition. 6 beings that could only be described as apex predators stood together, their conversation loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The Cathera, as she'd learned from her briefings, were 7 feet tall with muscular frames covered in natural armor plating. Their faces were vaguely feline with forward-facing eyes that marked them as hunters and retractable claws that could cut through steel. They moved with the fluid grace of born killers, and right now they were all looking at her. The largest of them, whose armor plating bore the scars of previous battles, stepped forward. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating. "So this is the human they sent us. I am Vexthor of the Crimson Clan, and I expected something more impressive." Sarah met his gaze steadily, her expression neutral. Years of military training had taught her to read situations quickly, and everything about this encounter screamed trouble. The other cadets in the area had stopped their conversations to watch, forming an impromptu arena around them. "Impressive how?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and level. She knew better than to show fear or aggression in a situation like this. Information first, then action. Vexthor's companions spread out slightly, their movement coordinated and predatory. "Your species claims to be warriors, yet you're barely half our height. You have no natural weapons, no armor, no enhanced reflexes. You're soft meat pretending to be steel." One of the other Kithara, this one with silver markings across his face, laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. "I heard humans break their bones just from running too hard." "Is this true, little one?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of underestimation settling around her like an old coat. She'd faced it her entire military career, first for being a woman in special forces, then for being smaller than most of her male counterparts. The faces changed, but the attitude remained the same. "Why don't we find out?" she said quietly. The challenge was issued before she could think better of it, and the moment the words left her mouth, she knew there was no taking them back. The Cathara's eyes brightened with predatory interest, and the crowd around them pressed closer. Vexthor's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh. Very well, human. Let's see what Earth's finest looks like when properly motivated. The first push came without warning. Vexthor's hand shot out faster than Sarah had expected, catching her in the center of her chest and sending her stumbling backward. The force behind it was tremendous, easily 3 times stronger than any human, and only her experience with explosive blasts kept her from falling completely. "Weak," Vexthor announced to the crowd. "No resistance at all." Sarah straightened slowly, her mind already analyzing the situation. She was outmatched in raw strength, speed, and reach. Fighting back directly would be suicide, but she hadn't survived 3 tours in hostile territory by fighting fair. The second push came from the side as another Cathara joined in. This time Sarah was ready, and instead of resisting the force, she went with it, using their own momentum to spin away and create distance. But there were 6 of them, and they moved to surround her with practiced efficiency. "Run, little human," the silver-marked one taunted. "Show us how your species survives. Do you flee like prey animals?" The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the spectacle. Sarah could see other species watching with various expressions. Some seemed concerned, others appeared entertained, and a few looked like they were taking notes for future reference. None moved to intervene. The third push came from behind, and this time Sarah couldn't avoid it entirely. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the metal deck as she caught herself. The impact sent shockwaves up her arms, but she rolled with it, coming up in a crouch. "Stay down," Vexthor commanded, looming over her. "This is where your species belongs, on the ground, looking up at your betters." Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward where her sidearm would have been, but the Academy had strict weapons policies. She was on her own, facing 6 alien predators with nothing but her training and experience. The smart play was to submit, to wait for faculty intervention to avoid escalating the situation further. But Sarah Chen hadn't become a Navy SEAL by making the smart play. Instead of standing up, she remained in her crouch, every muscle coiled like a spring. Her breathing was controlled, her pulse steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She'd been in worse situations than this, much worse. In Afghanistan, she'd once held off an entire Taliban squad for 6 hours with a broken rifle and a handful of grenades. 6 overgrown cats with an attitude problem were manageable. "Interesting," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent reception hall. "You know where I come from. When someone pushes you down 3 times, it usually means they're trying to tell you something." Vexthor's head tilted, confusion flickering across his predatory features. "And what is that, human?" Sarah's smile was sharp as broken glass. "That they're afraid you'll get back up." That is forward, driving her shoulder into the back of his knee with every ounce of force she could muster. The joint wasn't designed to take lateral pressure, and even with his superior strength basic anatomy, Vexthor's leg buckled, sending him stumbling forward. But Sarah wasn't done. As he fought for balance, she grabbed his arm and used his own momentum to send him crashing into 2 of his companions. It was a move she'd learned in her first week of SEAL training. When you can't match force with force, use leverage and timing instead. The remaining 3 Cathara reacted with impressive speed. But Sarah was already moving. She rolled between the legs of the nearest one, coming up behind him and using his larger frame as a shield against the others. Her hand found the emergency alarm button on the wall, not to summon help, but to add chaos to the situation. Klaxons began wailing throughout the reception hall as emergency lights bathed everything in red. The carefully organized crowd began to scatter as Academy security protocols activated, and in the confusion, Sarah made her move. She slipped away from the group of angry Cathara, using the panicking crowd as cover. But she didn't run far. Instead, she positioned herself near the central information desk, where Academy's staff would inevitably respond to the disturbance. When Vexthor and his friends came looking for her, they'd find her exactly where she was supposed to be, calm, collected, and looking like the innocent victim of an unprovoked attack. The security team arrived within minutes, a mixed group of species led by what appeared to be a heavily modified humanoid with cybernetic implants covering half his face. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with cadet incidents. "What happened here?" he demanded, his augmented eyes scanning the scene. Vexthor pointed directly at Sarah with one clawed finger. "The human attacked us without provocation. She's dangerous and unstable." Sarah remained exactly where she was, hands visible and non-threatening. "I was pushed to the ground 3 times by these cadets, Security Chief. I defended myself within Academy regulations when they attempted to continue their assault." The Security Chief's gaze shifted between them, his expression unreadable. Around the hall, dozens of other cadets watched the proceedings with obvious interest. This was clearly not the first time something like this had happened, but it was probably the first time anyone had seen a human involved. "Witness accounts?" the security chief asked. Several cadets stepped forward, their testimonies painting a clear picture of the Cathara as the aggressors. Sarah noted with interest that none of them seemed particularly surprised by Vexthor's behavior, suggesting this was a pattern rather than an isolated incident. After 15 minutes of questions and statements, the security chief rendered his verdict. "Cadet Vexthor, you and your squad will report for additional orientation on interspecies relations and academy conduct policies. Cadet Chen, you're cleared to continue with standard processing." As the crowd dispersed and the Cathara were led away, but not before Vexthor fixed her with a stare that promised future retribution, Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She'd won this round, but she knew it was far from over. An hour later, as she unpacked her belongings in her assigned quarters, Sarah reflected on what she'd learned. The Academy operated on a complex social hierarchy based on species reputation and individual capability. Humans were unknown quantities at the bottom of that hierarchy, which made them natural targets for established predator species looking to maintain their status. But Sarah had also learned something else. Despite their superior physical capabilities, these aliens fought with the same basic psychology she'd encountered in bullies throughout her military career. They expected intimidation to work, expected their targets to submit when faced with superior force. They weren't prepared for someone who'd been forged in real combat, someone who understood that the only way to deal with bullies was to hit back harder than they expected. Her quarters were spartanly furnished but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the Academy's central training complex. Tomorrow, real training would begin. Combat simulations, tactical exercises, advanced weapons systems. She'd be competing against beings who had evolved for warfare, who had natural advantages she could never match. But as Sarah Chen settled into her new environment, she wasn't thinking about her disadvantages. She was thinking about adaptation, about finding the spaces between raw power where skill and experience could make the difference. The galaxy was about to learn something important about humanity. They might not be the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most heavily armed, but they were definitely the most stubborn. And sometimes, in the vast complexity of interstellar warfare, stubborn was exactly what you needed to survive. Outside her window, alien ships continued their eternal dance among the stars, carrying the commerce and conflicts of 1,000 worlds. Sarah watched them for a while, then turned back to her preparations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opponents, new opportunities to prove that Earth's finest could hold their own among the stars. The Cathara had pushed her down 3 times today. Tomorrow she'd make sure they understood why that had been a mistake. Because Sarah Chen hadn't come to the Galactic Military Academy to make friends or maintain the status quo. She'd come to win. And losing had never been an option for humanity's best. The combat assessment facility was a marvel of alien engineering that stretched across 3 levels of the Academy's military wing. Sarah arrived early, her standard-issue training uniform marking her as distinctly human among the varied alien physiology on display. The other cadets wore similar uniforms, but theirs were modified to accommodate everything from extra limbs to environmental requirements for species that breathe different atmospheric mixtures. She took her place in the staging area, noting the careful way other species positioned themselves. The Kithara formed their own group near the advanced weapons rack, their predatory confidence unchanged from yesterday's encounter. Vexthor caught her eye and drew one claw across his throat in a gesture that needed no translation. To her left, a group of insectoid beings that resembled oversized mantises clicked their mandibles in what she assumed was conversation. Their movements were precise and calculated, suggesting a hive-mind mentality that would make them formidable in coordinated combat scenarios. On her right, the crystalline entities from yesterday had formed geometric patterns that seemed to shift based on some internal logic she couldn't decipher. The assessment began with basic physical evaluation. Sarah watched as each species demonstrated their natural capabilities on standardized equipment. The Kithara predictably dominated the strength and speed trials, their scores nearly off the charts. The insectoids, which she learned were called Zephyrians, showed incredible precision and reaction times. The crystalline Kethmori displayed an ability to alter their body density, becoming nearly invulnerable to physical damage at will. When Sarah's turn came, the silence in the facility was palpable. Every cadet, instructor, and monitoring system focused on the lone human as she approached the testing apparatus. She knew her scores would be underwhelming compared to the alien averages, but that wasn't the point. The point was establishing a baseline and showing she belonged here despite her apparent limitations. The strength test confirmed what everyone expected. She ranked in the bottom 10% of all cadets. Speed trials placed her slightly higher but still well below average. However, when the endurance trials began, something interesting happened. While most species showed dramatic performance drops after extended exertion, Sarah's scores remained remarkably consistent. Unusual, commented the lead instructor, a being that appeared to be a walking tree with military insignia carved into its bark-like skin. Human physiology maintains efficiency during prolonged stress. This suggests potential for extended engagement scenarios. The real surprises came during the problem-solving portions of the assessment. The facility presented a series of tactical scenarios designed to test decision-making under pressure. Most cadets approached these challenges with straightforward applications of their natural advantages. The Kithara used overwhelming force, the Zephyrians employed swarm tactics, the Kethmori relied on their defensive capabilities. Sarah approached each scenario differently. When faced with a simulated enemy position that the others had attacked head-on, she spent valuable time studying the terrain map, identifying alternative approaches, and calculating resource expenditure. Her solution involved a complex flanking maneuver that avoided direct confrontation entirely, neutralizing the threat while minimizing her own exposure. Inefficient, Vexthor called out during one scenario review. A true warrior faces enemies directly, not through deception and cowardice. The tree-like instructor, whose name was apparently Gruton, made a notation on his assessment device. Interesting perspective, Cadet Vexthor. However, the objective was neutralizing the threat, not demonstrating bravery. The human achieved the goal with 0 casualties and minimal resource expenditure. Some might call that efficiency rather than cowardice. As the day progressed, Sarah began to notice patterns in how different species interacted. The academy wasn't just a military training facility. It was a complex social ecosystem where ancient grudges, alliance systems, and species-based prejudices played out in miniature. The Kithara dominated through intimidation and raw power, but they were actually outnumbered by smaller species that formed coalition groups for mutual protection. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself sitting alone in the vast cafeteria until she was approached by an unexpected visitor. The being that settled across from her was unlike anything she'd seen in the briefing materials. Roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in what appeared to be living metal that shifted and flowed like mercury, with facial features that seemed more suggested than defined. "I am 6 of the Quantum Collective," the being said, its voice carrying harmonic overtones that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "I have been observing your performance with considerable interest." Sarah paused in her examination of what the food dispensers had identified as protein supplement compatible with human biology and looked up, observing how Your tactical approaches demonstrate a level of adaptive thinking that is uncommon among first-year cadets. More intriguingly, you show no deference to established hierarchies based solely on physical capability. Zix's metallic surface rippled, which Sarah interpreted as potentially positive body language. Where I come from, respect is earned through competence, not just natural advantages, Sarah replied carefully. She'd learned early in her military career to be cautious around intelligence-gathering attempts, and this conversation had that flavor. Indeed. This philosophy has served your species well in your planetary conflicts, I understand. Tell me, do you find the Academy's social dynamics familiar? Sarah took a bite of her meal, which tasted surprisingly like chicken, and considered her response. Bullies are bullies regardless of their species. The methods might be different, but the psychology is universal. Zix's surface shifted again, this time in what definitely seemed like amusement. An astute observation. The Cathara have maintained their dominant position through intimidation for the past 3 Academy generations. Most species either submit to their authority or form defensive alliances to avoid direct confrontation. And you? Sarah asked. The Quantum Collective finds physical dominance hierarchies inefficient. We prefer to operate through information networks and technological solutions. However, we have noted that direct confrontation of established power structures occasionally produces interesting results. Sarah sensed there was more to this conversation than casual interest. You're recruiting. I am exploring possibilities. The Academy operates on a complex system of alliances and rivalries. Independent operators like yourself often find that cooperation with like-minded individuals produces superior outcomes. Before Sarah could respond, the conversation was interrupted by a commotion across the cafeteria. Vexthor and 2 of his companions were standing over a table where several smaller humanoid beings sat. The confrontation appeared to be escalating rapidly. The Veltar, Zix explained, following Sarah's gaze. Prey species by Cathara standards. Highly intelligent, excellent engineers, but physically vulnerable. They've been targeted since the first day. Sarah watched as one of the Veltar, a being roughly her own height with delicate features and skin that seemed to glow with internal light, tried to stand up to the Cathara. The size difference made it look like a child confronting adults, and the outcome seemed inevitable. Academic regulations prohibit interference in inter-cadet conflicts unless they become physically violent, Zix noted, answering the question Sarah hadn't asked. Sarah stood up. Where are you going? Zix asked. To make some new friends. Sarah crossed the cafeteria with measured steps, her movement pattern designed to appear casual while putting her within striking range of the confrontation. She'd learned long ago that the key to effective intervention was timing and positioning. Problem here? She asked as she reached the table, directing her question to the Veltar who was still standing. Vexthor spun to face her, his expression darkening with recognition and anticipation. This doesn't concern you, human. Walk away. Sarah glanced at the Veltar, noting the gratitude mixed with fear in his expression. I'm Sarah Chen. Mind if I sit with you guys? The food's better when you have company. It was a simple gesture, but in the context of Academy social dynamics, it carried significant weight. By sitting with the Veltar, she was publicly aligning herself with them and rejecting the Cathara's authority over the situation. Vexthor's claws extended slightly, the scraping sound they made against his armor audible throughout the now quiet cafeteria. You think yesterday's humiliation taught you nothing? Step away from the prey, or we'll demonstrate exactly why they hide behind regulations instead of fighting for themselves. Sarah settled into the chair next to the standing Veltar and picked up an extra nutrition packet from the table. You know, I've been thinking about yesterday and I realized something important. What's that? Vexthor demanded. You had 6 people to help you push down one person half your size, and you still couldn't keep me down. That's not exactly the resume of apex predators. The insult hit its mark. Among predator species, being unable to dominate prey was the ultimate humiliation, and Sarah had just pointed out that failure in front of the entire Academy. Vexthor's companions shifted restlessly. their pack dynamics demanding a response to such a direct challenge. But Sarah had counted on that reaction. She'd positioned herself carefully, with the Veltar table between her and the Kythara, and her back to the wall so they couldn't surround her. More importantly, she'd made the challenge public enough that faculty would have to respond to any physical escalation. "You dare," Vexthor began, but he was interrupted by the arrival of Gruton and 2 other instructors. "Cadet Vexthor, report to my office immediately," the tree-like being commanded. "Cadet Chen, please finish your meal and report to the Tactical Planning Laboratory in 1 hour." As the Kythara were escorted away, Sarah turned to the Veltar who had been standing. Up close, she could see that his glowing skin was actually covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move like living circuitry. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I am Kixon of the Veltar Engineering Corps. We are grateful for your intervention." "No intervention necessary," Sarah replied. "Just thought you might like some company for lunch." Over the next hour, Sarah learned that the Veltar were indeed engineers, but they were also accomplished mathematicians and theoretical scientists. Their species had developed most of the technology that made galactic civilization possible, but their lack of physical prowess made them vulnerable to more aggressive species. "The Academy is supposed to be neutral ground," Kixon explained as they walked toward the Tactical Planning Laboratory. "But enforcement of anti-bullying policies depends on faculty being present, and the Kythara have learned to time their activities accordingly." "How long has this been going on?" Sarah asked. 3 Academy years. Each incoming class of Kythara has continued the tradition. Most species either submit or form large enough alliances to discourage direct confrontation. "But you haven't formed an alliance?" Kixon's patterns dimmed slightly, which Sarah interpreted as embarrassment. "The Veltar are not warriors. We offer technological support, but most species prefer allies who can contribute to physical confrontations." Sarah nodded, understanding the dynamic. It was the same problem that support personnel faced in human military hierarchies. Their contributions were essential, but they were often undervalued because they didn't involve direct combat. The Tactical Planning Laboratory turned out to be a massive holographic projection system that could create detailed 3-dimensional battlefields. When Sarah arrived, she found Gruton waiting with several other instructors and a handful of senior cadets from various species. "Cadet Chen, you've been selected for an advanced tactical exercise," Gruton announced. "You'll be working with a mixed team to solve a complex military scenario. This will give us a better assessment of your command and cooperation capabilities." Sarah looked around at her assigned team members and immediately understood this was no random selection. Along with Kixon and 2 other Veltar, she'd been paired with Zix from the Quantum Collective and several cadets from species she hadn't encountered before. It was clearly a group of individuals rather than representatives of dominant faction alliances. The scenario that materialized in the hologram was daunting. A multi-level urban environment under siege by superior forces. The defending team had limited resources, minimal air support, and was outnumbered 3-1. Traditional military doctrine suggested the position was indefensible. "Your objective is to hold the Central Command facility for 48 hours while reinforcements arrive," one of the instructors explained. "You have access to standard equipment and whatever resources you can scavenge from the environment. Begin." Sarah studied the projection, her mind automatically cataloging defensive positions, supply lines, and potential choke points. But she also noticed something else. Her team members were all waiting for her to take charge. Without discussion or formal designation, they'd apparently decided she was their leader. "All right," Sarah said finally. "Let's start with what each of us brings to the table. Kixon, you and your people are engineers. What can you do with the infrastructure in this scenario?" Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah listened as each team member outlined their capabilities. The Veltar could modify existing systems and create defensive improvements with available materials. Zix could interface with information networks and provide real-time intelligence. The other species brought various specialized skills ranging from advanced medical training to psychological warfare techniques. What emerged was a picture of a team with incredible potential, but no previous experience working together. They represented exactly the kind of small unit diversity that Sarah had found most effective in special operations, different specialties that could combine in unexpected ways. "Here's what we're going to do," Sarah began, gesturing to specific areas of the hologram. "Traditional defense doctrine says we should fortify the central position and wait for them to come to us." That's exactly what they'll expect. Instead, Sarah outlined a strategy that involved abandoning the central facility entirely for the first 12 hours, using that time to prepare the urban environment as a massive trap. When the attacking forces occupied the facility, they'd find themselves surrounded by a city that had been turned into a weapon against them. It was audacious, technically complex, and required perfect coordination between team members with no previous experience working together. In other words, it was exactly the kind of plan that Sarah specialized in. As they began implementing the strategy in simulation, Sarah noticed something interesting happening with her team. The Veltar stopped apologizing for their suggestions and began speaking with the confidence of experts. Zix started offering creative applications of technology that went beyond standard doctrine. The other specialists began finding ways to combine their abilities in novel approaches. By the end of the exercise, they'd not only held the facility for 48 hours, they'd captured the attacking commander and turned the scenario into a complete victory for the defending forces. The silence in the laboratory after the simulation ended was profound. The instructors were reviewing data streams and comparing results to historical performance metrics. When Gruthan finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been impressed surprise. "Cadet Chen, your team achieved the highest defensive rating in Academy history for this scenario. More significantly, you accomplished this with a group that had never worked together before today." Sarah looked around at her team members, noting the pride and satisfaction in their expressions. They'd discovered something important about themselves today. Individually, they might be underdogs in the Academy's social hierarchy, but together they were formidable. "The simulation was interesting," Sarah replied carefully, "but the real test will be how these lessons apply in actual training exercises." Gruden's bark-like features shifted in what she was learning to recognize as approval. "Which is why your team will be participating in next week's Academy War Games as a formal unit. Congratulations, Cadet Chen. You've just been promoted to squad leader." As the laboratory cleared out and her team members went their separate ways, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She'd come to the Academy as an individual representing humanity, but she was learning that success here required building alliances and working within the complex social dynamics of galactic civilization. The Kithara had pushed her down. Instead, she'd found her footing and started building something new. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but tonight she had something she hadn't expected to find at the Academy, a team she could trust and a mission that played to humanity's greatest strength. Not individual superiority, but the ability to bring out the best in others and forge unity from diversity. In a galaxy full of species competing for dominance, that might just be the most powerful weapon of all. The Academy War Games were held in a massive simulation complex that could recreate any environment from participating species' homeworlds. This year's scenario was particularly challenging, a contested moon base where multiple factions competed for control of vital resource extraction facilities. Sarah stood in the briefing amphitheater studying the holographic display while teams around her planned their approaches. 24 squads from across the Academy would be participating, representing every major species alliance and faction. The Kithara, predictably, commanded the largest and most physically imposing team. They'd allied themselves with the Thorian Hammers, a species of rock-like beings whose natural armor made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, and the Skyknife Consortium, aerial specialists whose wings and natural weapons gave them complete dominance in three-dimensional combat. Sarah's team occupied a different space entirely. Along with Kixon and his Veltar engineers, Zix from the Quantum Collective, and the specialists she'd worked with in the tactical exercise, she'd gained 3 new members. The first was Thys, a reptilian saurian whose species was known for stealth and infiltration capabilities. The second was Dr. Helix, a multi-limbed being from the Median Collective whose medical knowledge was legendary even among faculty. The third was perhaps the most surprising addition, Kara Stoneheart, a member of the Dwarven clans whose people had joined galactic civilization only recently, but brought with them engineering expertise that rivaled even the Veltar. "Attention, squad leaders," announced Admiral Voss, the Academy's commandant and a being whose species Sarah couldn't identify. His form seemed to shift between solid and energy states, and his voice resonated with authority that transcended language barriers. "This year's scenario will test not just combat capabilities, but resource management, alliance building, and adaptive strategy. The moonbase contains 6 extraction facilities. Control of 3 facilities for 12 continuous hours constitutes victory." Sarah studied the terrain display with growing interest. The moon's surface was a patchwork of industrial facilities, natural formations, and defensive positions. But what caught her attention were the underground tunnel systems that connected many of the facilities, tunnels that were too small for most of the larger species to navigate effectively. "Standard engagement protocols apply," Admiral Voss continued. "Non-lethal force only. All participants equipped with training gear that will simulate damage without causing actual harm. Medical personnel will be standing by, but remember that injuries sustained during simulation exercises are real injuries for evaluation purposes." After the briefing, Sarah gathered her team in their assigned preparation area. They had 6 hours to plan their approach before the exercise began, and she intended to use every minute effectively. "All right, everyone, what did you see in that terrain display that the other teams probably missed?" She began. Kixen was the first to speak, his bioluminescent patterns brightening with excitement. "The underground tunnel network connects 5 of the 6 facilities. If we could control those tunnels, we could move between facilities without surface exposure." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "But there's more. What do your infiltration skills tell you about facility security?" The Saurian scale shifted to a mottled brown pattern that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. "The facilities are designed to be defended from external assault, but the internal security systems assume friendly personnel will be operating them. If we could gain access from below, we could potentially take control of multiple facilities simultaneously." Dr. Helix added, her multiple arms gesturing enthusiastically. "But that would require coordinated timing and excellent communication." Sarah nodded, her plan beginning to take shape. "Kara, your people specialize in underground engineering. What would it take to modify those tunnel systems?" The dwarf's grin was fierce and predatory. "Give me Veltar technical support and access to the base's industrial equipment, and I can turn those tunnels into highways that only we can use. Maybe throw in some surprises for anyone who tries to follow us." Zix's metallic surface rippled with what Sarah now recognized as approval. "The information warfare opportunities are substantial. If we can access the facility's network systems, we can coordinate our actions while disrupting enemy communications." Sarah looked around at her team, seeing the same excitement and anticipation she'd felt before her best missions in Afghanistan. They weren't the strongest or the fastest or the most numerous, but they were smart, creative, and willing to think outside conventional tactical doctrine. "Here's what we're going to do," she said, activating the portable hollow projector Kixen had constructed. "While every other team fights for surface control of the facilities, we're going underground. Our objective isn't to hold territory, it's to control the flow of resources and information." Over the next 5 hours, they refined a complex plan that involved 3 phases. Phase 1 would be infiltration and reconnaissance, with this and Dr. Helix gathering intelligence while Kara and the Veltar prepared the underground systems. Phase 2 would be simultaneous facility penetration from below, with each team member assigned specific technical objectives. Phase 3 would be holding their positions while denying resources to enemy forces through sabotage and misdirection. It was ambitious, technically demanding, and completely unlike anything any of the other teams would be attempting. In other words, it was perfect. When the war games officially began at 060 hours, most teams immediately moved toward the most valuable facilities on the surface, exactly as Sarah had predicted. The Kithara Alliance began a direct assault on the Central Command facility, while other major factions secured defensive positions and prepared for extended sieges. Sarah's team was nowhere to be seen on the surface monitoring displays. Instead, they had entered the tunnel system through a maintenance access point that Kara had identified during their reconnaissance phase. The tunnels were indeed too small for most species to navigate comfortably, but Sarah and her team moved through them with increasing confidence. Surface teams are engaging at facilities Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, Zix reported, his connection to the base's information systems providing real-time intelligence. The Kithara Alliance has secured Alpha and is fortifying their position. Sarah checked her chronometer. They'd been underground for 2 hours and their modifications to the tunnel system were nearly complete. Kara had installed emergency lighting, communication relays, and several nasty surprises for anyone who might follow them. The Velter had interfaced with the facility's technical systems, giving them potential access to everything from environmental controls to security protocols. What's your status? Sarah whispered into her comm unit. I'm inside Facility Delta's maintenance level, came the reply. Security is focused entirely on the main entrances. Internal monitoring is minimal. Dr. Helix, Epsilon Facility Medical Bay is unguarded. I can access the main computer core from here without detection. Sarah smiled grimly. While the other teams fought pitched battles on the surface, her people were already inside half the facilities on the moonbase. Now came the difficult part. Execute Phase 2, she ordered. What happened next would be discussed in Academy tactical classes for years to come. In a span of 15 minutes, 3 facilities simultaneously experienced what appeared to be catastrophic system failures. Life support systems activated emergency protocols, forcing evacuation of all surface teams. Security systems began broadcasting contradictory information, creating chaos in communications networks. Most importantly, resource extraction operations ceased entirely as automated safety protocols took precedence. On the surface, the various faction leaders found themselves suddenly dealing with crises they hadn't anticipated. The Kithara, so focused on holding territory through force of arms, discovered that controlling a facility meant nothing if that facility couldn't function. Other teams that had secured positions found themselves unable to extract resources due to system malfunctions that defied their technical specialists' attempts at repair. What in the seven hells is happening down there? Vexthor's frustrated roar was audible even through the underground tunnel system. Sarah and her team moved through their tunnel network like ghosts, appearing at critical locations to complete technical objectives before vanishing again. When the Kithara finally sent teams into the tunnels to investigate, they found passages that had been modified to accommodate smaller beings and defensive positions that turned their size advantage into a liability. The first direct confrontation came when a squad of Thorian hammers attempted to force their way through a tunnel junction that Kara had specifically prepared for such an eventuality. The rock-like beings were virtually invulnerable to conventional weapons, but Kara had redirected a water circulation system to create a localized flood that their massive weight made impossible to navigate effectively. Enemy forces neutralized without casualties, Kara reported with obvious satisfaction. They're wet, embarrassed, and stuck in a mud trap that'll take them hours to dig out of. Similar encounters occurred throughout the underground system as surface teams attempted to regain control of their facilities. Each time, Sarah's team used mobility, technical expertise, and environmental advantages to avoid direct confrontation while achieving their objectives. By hour 8 of the exercise, the situation on the surface had become increasingly desperate for the conventional forces. Sarah's team controlled the resource extraction operations at 4 of the 6 facilities, and their sabotage efforts had disrupted coordination between major faction alliances. But the real turning point came when Admiral Voss himself joined the observation team. Cadet Chen, his voice resonated through the communication system, reaching every participant in the exercise. Report your current position and objectives. Sarah was crouched in a maintenance shaft beneath Facility Gamma, making final adjustments to the resource extraction controls while Kixon monitored security sensors. She could hear the sounds of combat from the surface as various factions fought for positions that were now strategically worthless. Admiral, My team is currently securing critical infrastructure to prevent enemy interference with resource extraction operations, she replied formally. From underground tunnels that you've modified without authorization? Sarah grinned, knowing that her actions were being broadcast to every team in the exercise. Sir, the scenario provided access to industrial equipment and existing infrastructure. We utilized available resources to accomplish our mission objectives. There was a pause, and when Admiral Voss spoke again, Sarah could hear something that might have been amusement in his voice. Indeed. And how many facilities do you currently control? 4 facilities are operating under our management, sir. Resource extraction is proceeding at optimal efficiency. The silence that followed was profound. Every team in the exercise had just learned that the small squad everyone had dismissed as minor players had quietly achieved 3/4 of what they needed for complete victory. Surface teams, Admiral Voss announced, you have 4 hours to regain control of critical facilities. Exercise parameters remain unchanged. What followed was the most intense period of the entire war games. Every major faction alliance redirected their efforts toward the underground tunnels, attempting to dislodge Sarah's team from their positions. But the tunnels had been specifically modified to neutralize traditional advantages, and Sarah's people knew the system intimately while their attackers were operating blind. The Skyknife Consortium discovered that their aerial superiority meant nothing in confined spaces. The Thorian Hammers found that their armor became a liability when navigating modified passages designed for smaller beings. Even the Cathara's natural weapons were less effective in close-quarters combat against opponents who could predict their movement patterns. But Sarah knew they couldn't hold their positions indefinitely. Eventually, sheer numbers would overcome their tactical advantages, and they needed only 1 more hour to achieve victory conditions. Zix, can you create a diversion? She asked through the comm system. Define diversion, came the response. Something that makes every surface team think they're about to lose everything they've worked for. Zix's metallic form rippled with what Sarah had learned was his version of predatory satisfaction. I believe I can accommodate that request. What happened next was a masterpiece of information warfare. Every major faction alliance simultaneously received intelligence suggesting that their rivals were about to achieve victory through coordinated attacks on critical facilities. The Cathara received reports that the Skyknife Consortium was preparing to seize all remaining facilities through aerial assault. The consortium learned that the Thorian Hammers had developed a plan to secure underground positions. The Hammers discovered that multiple minor factions were forming a coalition to overwhelm their positions through numerical superiority. None of these reports were true, but in the pressure of the exercise, none of the faction leaders had time to verify information before responding to perceived threats. The result was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Every major alliance abandoned their attempts to regain control of the underground system in favor of preventing their rivals from achieving victory. Surface combat intensified dramatically as factions that had been cooperating against Sarah's team suddenly turned on each other. While they fought for control of positions that could no longer extract resources, Sarah's team continued their quiet management of the underground extraction operations. At exactly hour 12, Admiral Voss's voice resonated through the exercise. Exercise complete. All teams report to debriefing positions. Sarah emerged from the tunnel system with her team to find the surface in chaos. Damaged equipment, exhausted participants, and the frustrated expressions of faction leaders who had just realized they'd been comprehensively outmaneuvered filled the moon-base simulation. The debriefing session was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. Admiral Voss projected the complete timeline of the exercise, showing how Sarah's team had achieved victory through technical expertise, environmental adaptation, and strategic misdirection rather than direct confrontation. Cadet Chen's squad accomplished several significant achievements during this exercise, the Admiral announced. They successfully modified existing infrastructure without damaging critical systems. They maintained resource extraction operations while denying those resources to enemy forces. Most importantly, they accomplished their objectives while sustaining 0 casualties and inflicting minimal damage to opposing forces. The silence in the debriefing amphitheater was profound. Sarah could see the expressions of grudging respect from species that had dismissed her team as irrelevant, mixed with the frustrated anger of factions that had been outplayed by beings they considered inferior. Vexthor stood up from his position among the Caithar alliance. With respect, Admiral, this was not combat. This was hiding underground like prey animals while real warriors fought honorably on the surface. Admiral Voss's form shifted slightly, energy patterns flickering across his surface in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as controlled anger. Cadet Vexthor defined combat for the assembled cadets. Direct confrontation between opposing forces where strength, speed, and courage determine the victor. I see. And in your experience, how often do galactic military operations involve direct confrontation under conditions of equal strength? Vexthor's expression faltered slightly. Sir, military doctrine emphasizes achieving objectives while minimizing casualties to friendly forces. Admiral Voss cut him off. Cadet Chen's team accomplished every objective of this exercise while inflicting zero permanent damage to opposed forces. They demonstrated adaptation, innovation, and effective resource utilization. Most importantly, they proved that tactical superiority can overcome numerical and physical disadvantages when properly applied. Sarah found herself standing without consciously deciding to do so. The entire amphitheater was watching her, waiting for her response to what was clearly a pivotal moment in Academy politics. Admiral, with respect to all participating teams, we weren't hiding underground, she said clearly. We were doing our jobs. Military operations aren't sporting contests where everyone gets a fair chance. They're life-and-death situations where you use every advantage available to accomplish your mission and bring your people home safely. She looked around at the various species representatives, noting the range of expressions from approval to anger to thoughtful consideration. Where I come from, we have a saying, the enemy gets a vote. You can plan for honor and direct confrontation all you want, but the enemy might have different ideas. Our job isn't to fight fair, it's to win while minimizing casualties to our own forces and civilian populations. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected source. Grutan, the tree-like instructor, began what Sarah could only describe as applauding. A rustling sound from his bark-like appendages that was picked up by several other faculty members. Excellent perspective, Cadet Chen, Admiral Voss said finally, which brings us to the purpose of this exercise. The Academy War Games are not simply competitive events. They are assessments of readiness for real military operations in galactic space. The Admiral's form solidified into something more traditionally humanoid, his expression becoming grave and serious. Because, cadets, you will soon have opportunities to test these lessons in actual combat situations. Intelligence reports indicate increasing activity from the Devourers in Outer Rim systems. Sarah felt her blood chill. The Devourers were mentioned only briefly in Academy orientation materials, described simply as hostile entities requiring military response, but the way Admiral Voss spoke about them suggested something far more serious than standard conflict scenarios. Advanced training exercises will begin next week, the Admiral continued. Squad assignments from this exercise will be maintained for specialized instruction. Prepare yourselves, cadets. The galaxy has need of warriors, and you may be called upon to serve sooner than anticipated. As the debriefing session concluded and cadets began filtering out of the amphitheater, Sarah found herself approached by an unexpected group. Representatives from several species that had been neutral during the exercise were gathering around her team, their expressions indicating serious interest in establishing dialogue. The Academy's social hierarchy was shifting, and for the first time since her arrival, Sarah Chen wasn't being evaluated as an individual representative of an unknown species. She was being recognized as a leader whose methods and results demanded respect. The Caithara had pushed her down, expecting her to submit to their authority. Instead, she'd found her footing, built a team, and proven that tactical excellence could overcome any physical advantage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and apparently real dangers in the form of entities called Devourers. But tonight, as Sarah Chen prepared for advanced combat training, she knew that humanity had more than proven their place among the stars. They'd shown the galaxy that Earth's greatest strength wasn't individual superiority, it was the ability to forge unity from diversity and accomplish the impossible through teamwork and determination. The real war was about to begin, and humanity was ready. The emergency klaxons began wailing at 0347 hours, cutting through the normal quiet of Academy's sleep cycles like a blade through silk. Sarah was awake and moving before the second alarm sounded, her SEAL training kicking in automatically. Around her, the other members of her squad were responding with similar efficiency. Months of advanced training had forged them into a cohesive unit that could function effectively under any circumstances. All squads report to combat staging areas immediately, Admiral Voss's voice resonated through the Academy's communication system. This is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. Sarah was already pulling on her combat gear as the lights came up to full illumination. The past 3 months of advanced training had been unlike anything she'd experienced in her military career, where her SEAL training had focused on human psychology and terrestrial environments. Academy instruction dealt with hostile entities that defied conventional understanding. The Devourers, as Sarah had learned, weren't simply another hostile alien species. They were something far worse, entities that consumed both matter and energy, leaving behind only empty space where entire star systems had once existed. They moved through space in ways that violated known physics, attacked without any apparent political motivation, and left no survivors to report their capabilities or intentions. Squad 7, report status, Sarah called out as her team assembled in the staging area. All present and combat ready, Kixon responded. The Veltar engineer had changed dramatically over the past months of training. Where once he'd been hesitant and apologetic, now he moved with the confidence of a specialist who knew his capabilities were essential to mission success. The staging area buzzed with controlled urgency as 47 squads prepared for deployment. This was the Academy's full complement of advanced training units, representing the finest military talent from across galactic civilization. The fact that they were all being deployed simultaneously suggested a threat level that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Attention all squad leaders!" Admiral Voss's voice cut through the preparation noise. "Intel reports Devourer activity in the Kepler-42 system. 3 colonial worlds with a combined population of 4.7 million. Evacuation operations are underway, but hostile entities have been detected moving toward the inner system." Sarah felt the familiar pre-combat calm settling over her as she absorbed the tactical situation. Evacuation operations meant civilian protection priorities. Multiple worlds suggested complex coordination requirements, and Devourer entities meant they were facing enemies that could potentially consume entire planets. "Squad assignments will be transmitted to your personal devices," Admiral Voss continued. "Some squads will support evacuation operations, others will engage hostile entities directly. All squads will coordinate through the battle network system we've been developing." Sarah checked her assignment and felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Squad 7 had been assigned to direct combat operations against Devourer entities. They'd be deploying to Kepler-42c, a mining world where hostile contact was expected within 6 hours. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings," Admiral Voss's tone became formal, carrying the weight of military tradition from a dozen different species. "Today you transition from cadets to active military personnel. Your training has prepared you for this moment, but remember that real combat is always different from simulation. Watch out for each other, trust your training, and accomplish your missions." The transport flight to Kepler. 442 took 4 hours through hyperspace, giving Sarah's squad time to review intelligence reports and finalize their tactical preparations. What they learned during the flight was both fascinating and terrifying. The Devourers appeared to be biomechanical entities of enormous size. The smallest detected specimens were over 1 kilometer long, while the largest defied easy measurement. They moved through space without apparent propulsion systems, ignored conventional weapons fire, and consumed matter through unknown processes that left behind areas of absolute vacuum. Previous engagement reports are limited, Dr. Helix noted, her multiple arms managing several data streams simultaneously. Most encounters have ended with complete loss of defending forces. The few surviving accounts describe entities that can alter local space-time geometry and manipulate gravitational fields. Sarah studied the tactical projections with growing unease. Everything about the Devourers violated conventional military doctrine. How do you fight enemies that can survive in vacuum, ignore directed energy weapons, and manipulate physics itself? How do you develop tactics against entities that left no survivors to report their vulnerabilities? There's something else, Zix added, his metallic surface rippling with patterns Sarah had learned indicated deep concern. The Quantum Collective's deep space monitoring networks have detected unusual energy signatures preceding Devourer appearances. We believe they may be capable of interdimensional travel. Kara Stoneheart looked up from her equipment check with a grim expression. So we're fighting enemies that come from another dimension, ignore conventional weapons, and eat planets for breakfast. Anybody else thinking this mission briefing could use some good news? Thys, the Saurian infiltration specialist, shifted to his combat coloration, modeled black and gray patterns that would blend with shadows and debris. The good news is that we've trained for exactly this scenario. Academy doctrine for Devourer engagement emphasizes mobility, coordination, and exploiting environmental advantages. Sarah nodded, reviewing the tactical parameters they'd drilled endlessly during advanced training. Conventional weapons were ineffective, but coordinated attacks on specific anatomical targets had shown some success in previous engagements. The key was identifying vulnerable points and maintaining sustained fire from multiple angles while avoiding the entity's defensive capabilities. Remember, our primary objective isn't destroying these things, Sarah reminded her squad. We're buying time for evacuation operations while gathering intelligence on Devourer capabilities and vulnerabilities. Survival is our first priority, mission accomplishment is second, and heroics will get us all killed. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace above Kepler 442c, the tactical situation was immediately apparent. The mining world surface was scarred with massive excavation operations that had carved geometric patterns into the planet's crust, but those patterns were being systematically erased as three enormous entities moved across the surface, leaving perfectly spherical voids where solid matter had once existed. The Devourers were unlike anything Sarah had imagined. Each entity appeared to be a fusion of organic and mechanical systems, with surfaces that shifted between metallic sheen and organic texture. They moved with flowing grace that suggested intelligence, but their actions showed no regard for the massive infrastructure they were systematically consuming. Contact established with evacuation coordinators, Zix reported. 70% of civilian population has been successfully extracted. Remaining personnel are industrial workers attempting to salvage critical equipment. Sarah studied the deployment patterns of other Academy squads through the battle network. Most units were focusing on evacuation support or establishing defensive perimeters around extraction sites. But Squad 7 had been assigned a different mission. They were going to attempt direct engagement with a Devourer entity to test new tactical theories. All right, people, this is why they trained us, Sarah announced as their transport approached the landing coordinates. Kixen, I want sensor arrays deployed the moment we hit ground. Kara, prepare demo charges according to the mining site specifications we studied. Thys, you're our early warning system. Any movement from our target gets reported immediately. The landing site was an abandoned mining facility approximately 5 kilometers from the nearest Devourer entity. The structure had been hastily evacuated, leaving behind equipment and supplies that could be adapted for military use. More importantly, the facility's underground systems provided protected positions from which to observe and potentially engage their target. Sarah's first view of a Devourer entity up close was profoundly unsettling. The creature, if it could be called that, was nearly 2 kilometers long and appeared to be consuming a mountain, but the consumption wasn't happening through any visible mechanism. Instead, matter simply ceased to exist in perfectly spherical areas wherever the entity focused its attention. Sensor readings are inconsistent. Kixon reported, his bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly as he processed data. The entity appears to exist partially in normal space and partially in some other dimensional framework. Our targeting systems can't establish consistent lock-on. Sarah studied the entity through high-powered optics, looking for anything that resembled vulnerability. The Devourer's surface was covered with what appeared to be sensory organs of various types, but they seemed to be focused on the material it was consuming rather than potential threats. Dr. Helix, what do your biological scans show? The entity displays characteristics of both living tissue and constructed machinery, the medical specialist replied. However, its energy patterns suggest a form of consciousness that operates on completely different principles from any known species. Sarah was beginning to understand why previous engagements had been unsuccessful. Military doctrine assumed enemies with recognizable motivations, vulnerabilities, and behavioral patterns. The Devourers operated according to completely alien logic that made conventional tactical analysis nearly impossible. But Sarah had learned something important during her years in special operations. When conventional tactics failed, you adapted by exploiting whatever advantages you could identify. The Devourers might be nearly invulnerable to direct attack, but they were also apparently unaware of smaller threats. New plan, Sarah announced. We're not trying to kill this thing. We're going to get its attention, gather intelligence on its defensive capabilities, and see if we can disrupt its consumption process. Over the next 2 hours, Squad 7 implemented the most dangerous mission of Sarah's military career. Using the mining facility's equipment, they created a series of controlled explosions designed to test the Devourer's responses to various stimuli. The entity reacted to seismic disturbances by shifting its position, suggesting it could detect and respond to environmental changes. When they progressed to directed energy attacks using the facility's industrial laser systems, the Devourer's response was immediate and terrifying. The entity turned its attention toward their position, and suddenly the air around the mining facility began to shimmer with energy patterns that made Sarah's skin crawl. Gravitational anomalies detected, Kixon reported, his voice tight with stress. The entity is manipulating local space-time geometry. Recommend immediate withdrawal. But before Sarah could give the order, something unexpected happened. The Devourer stopped its advance and appeared to be studying them. Its massive sensory organs focused on their position with what could only be described as curiosity. It's not attacking, Dr. Helix observed with amazement. The entity appears to be analyzing us rather than attempting immediate destruction. Sarah felt a chill of realization. It's learning. The Devourer is trying to understand what we are and how we function. The implications were staggering. If the Devourers were capable of learning and adaptation, they represented a threat that could potentially evolve beyond any defensive measures. But it also suggested something else. They might be intelligent enough to communicate with. Zix, can you interface with any of the entity's energy patterns? Look for anything that resembles information transmission or data exchange. The Quantum Collective member's surface rippled with complex patterns as he attempted to analyze the Devourer's emissions. There are organized information flows, but they operate on quantum principles I don't fully understand. However, I believe I can establish basic communication protocols. What followed was the most surreal experience of Sarah's life. Using Zix as an intermediary, Squad 7 attempted to establish communication with an entity that existed partially outside normal space-time. The exchange was limited and difficult to interpret, but certain concepts seemed to translate across the dimensional barrier. The Devourer entity, as far as they could determine, was not attacking the mining world out of hostility. Instead, it appeared to be harvesting specific materials that were somehow essential to its continued existence. The systematic consumption patterns weren't random destruction. They were precise extraction operations. It's not trying to destroy the planet, Sarah realized. It needs something that exists here, but it doesn't understand that we're intelligent beings rather than part of the planetary ecosystem. The communication session lasted for nearly an hour before the Devourer entity concluded its analysis and moved on to continue its harvesting operations. But Squad 7 had accomplished something that no previous military unit had achieved. They'd established meaningful contact with entities that had previously been considered mindless destroyers. Squad 7 to Academy Command, Sarah transmitted as they prepared to withdraw from the mining facility. Mission accomplished. We have significant intelligence on devourer behavioral patterns and have successfully established communication protocols. The response from Admiral Voss was immediate and intense. Repeat your last transmission, Squad 7. Did you say you established communication? Affirmative, Command. The entities appear to be intelligent and capable of learning. They're not attacking out of hostility, they're harvesting specific materials that are apparently essential to their survival. The silence that followed was profound, and Sarah could imagine the implications of her report reverberating through Academy Command. If the devourers could be communicated with, it opened possibilities that changed everything about humanity's understanding of the threat. Outstanding work, Squad 7, Admiral Voss finally responded. Return to extraction coordinates immediately. This intelligence will require complete analysis and strategic reevaluation. As Sarah's squad made their way back to the evacuation zone, she reflected on what they'd accomplished. They'd come to Kepler 442c expecting to engage in combat operations against implacable enemies. Instead, they discovered that the galaxy's greatest threat might actually be a species whose needs could potentially be negotiated rather than fought. The evacuation of Kepler 442c continued for another 8 hours, but the devourer entities made no attempt to interfere with the operations. They continued their systematic harvesting, but they avoided areas where human activity was concentrated. It was as if they'd learned to distinguish between the planetary resources they needed and the intelligent beings who inhabited the world. During the flight back to the Academy, Sarah's squad debriefed extensively on their encounter. The implications of successful communication with devourers would reshape galactic military doctrine and potentially open new avenues for diplomatic solutions to conflicts that had previously seemed hopeless. You realize what this means, Dr. Helix observed during one of their discussion sessions. If devourers can be communicated with, it suggests they have needs and motivations we can potentially understand and address. Zix's surface rippled with patterns Sarah had learned indicated deep satisfaction. More significantly, it demonstrates that even entities operating on completely alien principles can be reached through persistent effort and creative thinking. Sarah nodded, but she was also thinking about larger implications. Squad 7's success hadn't come from superior firepower or conventional tactical advantage. It had come from approaching an impossible situation with flexibility, creativity, and willingness to question fundamental assumptions. They were lessons that applied far beyond military operations. In a galaxy filled with species competing for resources and dominance, the ability to find common ground and establish communication might be humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization. The Cathara had pushed her down, expecting her to submit to their authority. Instead, Sarah Chen had risen to become a leader whose methods had proven effective against the galaxy's greatest threat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Academy Command analyzed the intelligence they'd gathered and developed new protocols for devourer encounters. But tonight, as Sarah Chen prepared her mission reports, she knew that humanity had proven something important about themselves. They weren't just warriors who could hold their own among the stars. They were problem solvers who could find solutions where others saw only impossible obstacles. The real war might be just beginning, but humanity was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, and they wouldn't be facing those challenges alone. Squad 7 had shown that cooperation and understanding could overcome even the most seemingly insurmountable differences. In a galaxy where strength was often measured by the ability to destroy enemies, Sarah Chen had proven that sometimes the greatest victory was learning how to avoid fighting at all. 6 months after the Kepler V2 incident, Sarah Chen stood before the assembled Academy faculty and student body as the first human to complete the full Galactic Military Academy program. The graduation ceremony was being broadcast across the galaxy, with representatives from hundreds of species watching as Admiral Voss prepared to deliver his address to the graduating class. The changes that had occurred in those 6 months were profound and far-reaching. Sarah's successful communication with devourer entities had led to the establishment of the Galactic Contact Protocol Division, a new branch of military science dedicated to establishing dialogue with previously hostile species. The academy curriculum had been restructured to include courses on interdimensional communication, xenopsychology, and diplomatic resolution of military conflicts, but perhaps the most significant change was in the academy's social dynamics. The rigid hierarchy based on physical dominance had given way to a more complex system that valued diverse skills and collaborative problem-solving. Species that had once been marginalized, the Veltar, the Quantum Collective, the smaller independent civilizations. Sarah looked out at the graduation audience and smiled at the sight of Vexthor sitting in the front row. The Kythara warrior had become an unexpected ally after witnessing Squad 7's success in the field. He'd requested transfer to Sarah's advanced training program and had proven to be an excellent student of human tactical doctrine. His transformation from antagonist to collaborator had become a symbol of the Academy's new direction. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings," Admiral Voss began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and the promise of change. "Today we celebrate the graduation of the Academy's most accomplished class in our institutional history." Sarah's squad stood together on the platform, their ceremonial uniforms bearing decorations that represented achievements no previous Academy class had imagined possible. Kixon wore the ribbon of the Academy's first Technological Innovation Award for his development of interdimensional communication systems. Dr. Helix had received recognition for establishing first-aid protocols for energy-based life forms. Zix had been honored for his work in quantum communication networks that could function across dimensional barriers. "This class has redefined what it means to be a military professional in galactic civilization," Admiral Voss continued. "They have shown us that strength comes not just from individual capability, but from the ability to forge unity from diversity and find solutions where others see only obstacles." Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd arrived at the Academy as Earth's lone representative, expected to prove humanity's worth through individual achievement. Instead, she'd discovered that humanity's greatest strength lay in their ability to bring out the best in others and create teams that were greater than the sum of their parts. The formal ceremonies concluded with the presentation of commission documents that authorized each graduate to serve as military officers in galactic civilization. Sarah accepted her papers from Admiral Voss with a mixture of pride and anticipation for what lay ahead. "Congratulations, Commander Chen," Admiral Voss said formally, using her new rank for the first time. "Your first assignment will be establishing the Contact Protocol Division's operational headquarters. You'll have full authority to recruit personnel from Academy graduates and develop training programs for interspecies communication." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by beings from across the galaxy who wanted to discuss opportunities for cooperation and alliance. The Academy's social transformation had opened possibilities that extended far beyond military applications, and everyone wanted to be part of the new paradigm that Squad 7 had pioneered. But it was Vexthor who approached her with the most significant proposal. "Commander Chen," the Kythara said formally, "I wish to request assignment to your new division. I believe my species has much to learn from human tactical doctrine, and we have capabilities that could contribute to your mission." Sarah studied her former antagonist with appreciation for how much they'd both changed. "What capabilities are you thinking of, Vexthor?" "The Kythara clans control trade routes that connect 47 systems in the Outer Rim. If devourers can be negotiated with rather than fought, we want to be part of those negotiations. Our species' future may depend on learning new ways to resolve conflicts." It was exactly the kind of thinking that Sarah had hoped to inspire. The galaxy's warrior species were beginning to understand that their greatest victories might come through diplomacy rather than combat. "Request approved," Sarah said, extending her hand in the human gesture of agreement. "Welcome to the Contact Protocol Division. Over the next several hours, Sarah's informal reception became a recruitment session as representatives from dozens of species expressed interest in joining her new organization. The Veltar wanted to contribute their technological expertise. The Quantum Collective offered their information networks. Even the Skyknife Consortium proposed establishing aerial reconnaissance capabilities for peaceful contact missions. As the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah found herself in conversation with Admiral Voss about the broader implications of what they were building. The Contact Protocol Division represents a fundamental shift in how galactic civilization approaches conflict resolution, the Admiral observed. But success will depend on maintaining the principles that made Squad 7 effective: diversity, cooperation, and willingness to challenge conventional assumptions. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with her new position. Admiral, I've learned that every species brings unique capabilities to collaborative efforts. Our job isn't to eliminate those differences, but to find ways to combine them effectively. Indeed. And what about Earth's role in this new paradigm? Sarah considered the question carefully. Earth's contribution isn't superior technology or enhanced physical capabilities. We're good at seeing connections that others miss, finding common ground between different perspectives, and building teams that can accomplish what individuals cannot. Admiral Voss's energy patterns shifted in what Sarah had learned was his expression of approval. An excellent assessment. The galaxy has need of such capabilities now more than ever. The following morning, Sarah stood in the hangar bay where she'd first arrived at the academy, preparing to depart for her new assignment. The Contact Protocol Division's headquarters would be established on Neutral Space Station, positioned at the intersection of multiple trade routes where representatives from various species could meet safely.